Welcome to Are You Fucking Shitting Me? I'm April.
And I'm Rachel.
That's our spooky. My husband thinks that our theme music is very spooky.
I know, it's funny. I think of it as I'm solving a mystery.
Yeah, I think of it as very sleuthy.
Yeah.
Pink Panther-ish.
I imagine
I
someone
like
with a very big...
Magnifying glass?
Yeah, that thing. I talk good, people. Welcome to this episode.
Yeah, I'm usually the one that talk good. So I'm happy to help you out for once. So last episode, we talked about Amazons and talked about how Amazons were real.
Which still makes me so happy.
Makes me very happy too. And we had a listener who wrote to me and wanted to share a little bit about Marston. Marston was the creator of Wonder Woman. What our fair listener told us is that Marston was also really instrumental in creating the polygraph, the lie detector.
It all comes together now. Truth telling. It looks like what he actually did is he didn't create the lie detector. He created the systolic blood pressure test, which then became a component of the modern polygraph.
However, his wife, Elizabeth Holloway Marston, she's the one who suggested that there was a connection between emotion and blood pressure. So,
God damn it, Marston. Quit stealing your wife's ideas.
Yeah, we know who the smarty pants was in that family. Anyway, thanks so much to our listener for writing to us about that. That was fun to find out.
Yeah, we love the extra information. And if anybody has anything that they want to share with us, maybe you'll hear it on the air.
Yeah, send it to us, or we'll probably want to look into it some more.
I do want to just say I said on the air, though we're not on the air.
Well, we're on the air. We're on some kind of air.
Yeah, I mean...
We're in the air.
It's all on the air, man. It's all trippy on the air.
On to this episode.
So anyways, we also initially went into the Amazons thinking we were going to go all the way up to see if there were any matriarchal or egalitarian society these days. And we were looking into statistics all over the world. Where are women the most equal? Which you found a really weird fact.
Yeah, I found that Rwanda is the 6th most gender equal country in the world.
And the U.S.?
At the time I looked, it was 26, and I think maybe it's gone down to 28.
I believe it's dropped down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Iceland is number 1. So we interviewed Amanda Foreman, who is a British documentarian and historian. She has a great documentary on Netflix called Ascent of Woman. And so we thought she would be a great addition to the Amazons episode and talk about ancient egalitarian societies and compare them to any matriarchal or egalitarian societies in modern day. And her interview didn't quite fit in with the way that we wanted to tell the Amazon story, so we thought it would make its own great episode.
Yeah, she really goes over a lot of information in her documentary. It's fascinating. She goes from the earliest civilizations that you can find, and we do recommend watching that in itself, but we wanted to talk to her directly, so she gets her own episode.
So let's get to Amanda Foreman. Here she is.
Thank you so much for talking to me. I'm very excited, and I absolutely loved the documentary series.
Oh, well, I'm really thrilled to hear that. Thank you so much for telling me.
Can you talk about gender equality in ancient cultures?
The question of gender equality in ancient cultures is very difficult to pin down because there are so many different ancient cultures, and each one had a very different approach to both equality and gender. It's safe to say that among the ancient cultures that are best known, the Romans, the Greeks, for example, the Persians, there was no concept of gender equality, and they would have laughed at the idea. But that doesn't mean that throughout the ancient world itself, all women had a bad time or suffered total subordination at all times. The two cultures that stand out most interestingly, number one, Egypt, where even though that was a patriarchy, ancient Egypt nevertheless recognized that men and women needed to treat one another with respect, needed to have equal access to the law. And if you look, for example, at an ancient Egyptian marriage contract, it can go on for several pages about the needs and rights of the wife as well as the husband. But the ancient culture that is the most interesting in terms of gender equality is the ancient Sumerian culture, which is the first civilization that we know of in the world that came into being around the late 5th millennium. It's around 4000 BC, because that's where we can study the formation of patriarchy, the formation of the state, of hierarchies, of class, of exploitation, for example, and try to figure out what was the role that gender played within that. And what's so fascinating is that there is no unilinear narrative that we can come up with. That although gender did play a role, it isn't obvious what that role was.
That's really interesting. So are you able to tell in these cultures if or how women's roles and men's roles were divided? So it sounds like they weren't really divided. They shared in responsibilities.
There's a notion that before the formation of the state, most societies were fairly egalitarian. But you can live in an egalitarian society where things are shared out equally and responsibilities shared out equally and still have gender inequality. But the archaeological record won't necessarily always show that up. But one geographic area where that does show up is in the very first large-scale settlement that archaeologists have found, which is Çatalhöyük in Turkey, in Anatolia. And this settlement, which had about 8,000 people living in it by the end, flourished for over 2,500 years, between 8,500 and 6,500 BC. And what's fascinating about this settlement, which is at the dawn of agriculture, and you can see these people were definitely taking up some aspects of farming, is that men and women did not seem to occupy the kinds of gendered roles or gendered labor that became commonplace later on. And the reason that we know that is because these men and women, these inhabitants of the town, have the same wear and tear on their bone structure. They are buried in the same way, that they seem to have performed the same tasks in the same areas of their homes. So, for example, they have the same kinds of soot deposits on their lungs. So if they were working on tasks, they were done around the fire together. So these are incredibly important markers for a kind of gendered equality. What kind of tasks these men and women would have done would be making figurines, making baskets, making tools, cooking, preparation of medicines or incense burners, or some kinds of special herb brews or teas for religious ceremonies. All these things would have taken place inside the house. Outside the house, there would have been hunting, and we know from murals on the walls that hunting played a large part, and also cultivating some very early forms of barley, for example, or wheat. What's fascinating about Çatalhöyük, and you can then stretch this all the way down to ancient Greek society, is that they both have very strong religious and spiritual cultures. Now, the Greeks had their ancient myths and had their rituals, but what we know from ancient Greek culture, and you have to use it to work backwards, is that just because in the myths males and females are depicted but as both having strong roles, as both being autonomous agents, as both being venerated, doesn't necessarily translate in any meaningful way to everyday life. So ancient Greece was a highly restrictive patriarchy. And just the same way, if aliens were to come down today and see millions of Barbies all over the planet, that doesn't necessarily mean that blonde-haired, blue-eyed women are worshipped as goddesses. The shift to patriarchy has fascinated historians and archaeologists for or nearly 200 years now. It used to be believed that before patriarchy there was matriarchy. That theory has now been thoroughly discredited, that the actual inverse of patriarchy doesn't seem to have happened anywhere. What we see are egalitarian hunter-gatherer tribes. So what's the difference and what happens? Well, agriculture plays a large role in this, as does the size of the population. That size and complexity produces stratified societies. And when there is competition for land, then you have aggression, militarization, organization, and surplus. And those aspects of human culture lead to what we call the charismatic leader theory, where an individual steps forward and then builds a power base, and that power base will be partly based around physical strength. Just as in the animal world, the stronger dominate the weaker, and for as long as physicality plays a role, then it's much easier for the male of the species to dominate, subordinate the female of the species. What's happened in the 21st century, which is so fascinating, is that for the first time in human history, brawn is one of the least interesting and motivating aspects of human society. Brains is what gets you everywhere.
Yeah, I wanted to know what you thought about where we stand now in terms of gender equality.
Gender equality is entirely possible. There are practical roadblocks that are in the way in most Western countries. The biggest one is the developed world's somehow seeming inability to figure out what to do about childcare. And until that is sorted out, until that playing field is leveled, then working, educated women who aspire to have the same jobs in the same position with the same pay as working, educated men will be in a competition with them, because who is going to give up that time to look after the children? You can't simply put your child in the deep freeze during the day and then defrost them at night.
Do you see that happening here and in other Western countries? I mean, it's already happened in places like Sweden and Finland, it seems, but...
Well, it's a very interesting point that you've just brought up. Has it happened in Sweden? The answer is it has not happened in Sweden. The Sweden still has a huge deficit of women in high-level jobs where seniority is an aspect. Unless men and women are forced to take the same kind of maternity and paternity leave for the same amount of time and have to have exact equality over the burdens of family, then you will always see men being able to, husbands and childless men being able to get ahead. If a woman remains childless, then all bets are off. And as we know from what goes on around us, childless women are often at exactly the same level as their male cohorts. So it's really the childcare factor that is the single greatest obstacle today.
Wow.
It's incredibly unfair. It's a kind of weird twist of life. What happens in places like the United States or in Britain, where the childcare is haphazard and maternity leave is so ungenerous, though, the irony is that those women who are forced back into work after 6 weeks or 8 weeks and aren't given the same kind of generous parental leave options suffer less in the workplace
Wow.
in terms of seniority, but at what cost? The cost is terrible.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you think that the shift eventually will be more egalitarian? Do you see a bigger shift toward matriarchy, perhaps, as we move forward?
I think I definitely see the shift towards egalitarianism happening, and I see it happening already. I think that testosterone plays a big role in aggression, and I'm part of that school of thought that believes that men and women do bring different characteristics and traits to the table. I believe that women generally are more collaborative than men, and that as we see the brain culture, the entrepreneur culture, the lateral thinking culture taking over from the straightforward, physically competitive culture, that you will see changes in the way societies arrange themselves. The problem is that when you have an uneven distribution of egalitarianism, you can become vulnerable to societies that don't subscribe to that. So, to give you an ancient history example, in the second millennium, the greatest civilization that there ever was still Sumer, the Mesopotamians. They were the ones who invented absolutely everything we associate with civilization, from schools to architecture to education to law to banking to science to the calendar to mathematics to medicine, everything. And they were defeated by just incredibly aggressive barbarians who destroyed their culture and replaced it with nothing. It does happen, and there's no reason why that can't happen now. That you have a culture which is violent and aggressive and has no respect for human rights, doesn't have any interest in egalitarianism or gender equality whatsoever, has a kind of culture of death and aggression, and they are quite capable of destroying a softer, kinder, nicer, less aggressive, less violent culture than itself. Again, I mean, cycles do happen.
Yeah.
When Rome fell, one of the interesting things is that when Rome fell finally in the 5th century AD, and the Visigoths finally walked into Rome having captured the city, they kind of walked around it in wonder. They were just amazed and fascinated at this culture that they had defeated, and all the buildings, the plumbing, the sophistication, the writing that they had. And of course, after Rome in the West fell, for the next several hundred years, all those techniques disappeared. The ability to make cement was lost for 1,000 years.
Wow.
There was no more indoor plumbing. Nobody wrote except for a few monks and nuns and convents and monasteries. People forgot how to make the color purple.
Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, no more tall buildings were made. The Romans couldn't make skyscrapers, but they made very tall buildings. People stopped making them. They forgot how to. Nobody knew how to make a dome for 1,000 years.
It's incredible.
Yes. So what can? Yes, actually.
And it's just terrifying to think that how easily that could happen again. You know, it could happen.
Yes, it could, which is why we have to be vigilant and not be complacent. And I believe also, remember that there are different battles going on right now, and we have to pick our battles and be sure that we're fighting the right one. So, although it's very important that women in the United States, for example, can go into a university class and study whatever they like and feel comfortable in their classes, perhaps worrying about a word or a look or a choice of a text, and having a great deal of anxiety and hurt feelings about it, that might be important, but it might be more important to be fighting on behalf of the kidnapped girls whose education has been interrupted in Nigeria by Boko Haram.
Something much more than themselves.
Possibly. It may be that we need to continually remind ourselves where the enemy lies and what the real threats to gender equality are.
Wow.
Yep.
I want to point out right now, because that is a really valid point, what we fight for, picking our battles. Not that all battles don't matter. When April spoke with Amanda, to be frank, it was before the election of Donald Trump. And I think that it's become pretty clear that what has become acceptable in America towards women, towards people of color, towards the LGBT community, all of those things have shifted. Not that they weren't there before, but there has become an open aggression.
And I think women and men are really aware of what's going on and are getting out there and standing up for other people, standing up for themselves, and also standing up for the rights of others. I mean, you could see that with the Women's March for sure, which had 5 million people worldwide coming out. The biggest protests in the United States ever. You know, I mean, it's interesting to listen to this interview again also because I interviewed her before the election, like you said, and we all thought that Hillary was going to get elected. And so we kind of thought that feminism, egalitarianism was going to move in a different direction. And it was interesting to me to hear about how she feels the biggest thing that we need to overcome is childcare.
Yeah, the childcare part too. That's also really interesting. How was it? It's Norway that.
Well, Norway and Sweden both have very progressive policies on childcare, and so I think in Sweden, moms and dads get something like 2 years off per child, something really huge. But it was super fascinating to hear her say that that doesn't actually help women move forward because they don't get to progress in their career. And progressing in your career, she believes, will make you more equal. But I think that's a really interesting argument because that's then saying that success is only determined by a career.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that is true.
Well, shouldn't success be defined by each person individually?
Yes, I agree.
So
if the barometer is career.
Yeah, I remember watching this really corny movie. Is it Mona Lisa Smiles? It takes place in the 50s, and there's a girl, and she was super feminist.
Was Julia Roberts
Roberts was in it.
Oh, yeah, and she was a teacher or something?
Yeah, and someone's mad at this really smart girl because she wants to get married and have a kid instead of going into the workforce or whatever. And she pointed this out, and this did shift my perception a bit of feminism. She's like, but isn't feminism meaning that I get to choose what I want? And I thought that's pretty damn impressive that we forget to remember that feminism, it's cool. Like equal pay for equal jobs, and the pay gap is crazy. But that's not the only definition of who a human being is your job. I mean, I'm an artist. I'm a painter. I've never wanted a successful career. Success for me would be able to make stuff every day and live happily with that. Now, if I'm doing the same job as another person, I absolutely want to get paid the same if I've got the same quality. So that's a different thing. What your goal is versus what your market worth is, those are different things, I think.
Yeah, I don't know that we're progressive enough as a society to deal with that yet.
Yeah, maybe not.
Which is unfortunate because I think not only would that help society accept people for who they are, which is where I want to get to. That's my idea of a society that I want to live in. But I feel like that would be good for a person's own feeling of value and their own feeling of worth. Because I was always raised to you grow up, you buy a house, you have a job where you make good money. Although my mom was always like, don't ask for too much money. You don't want them to think you're greedy. Yeah,
That's
what
a
kind
really
of crazy advice is that we
very
were given?
crazy.
So crazy. So, but then when I think about that advice and the whole idea of money and fame, and no, I just want to do the things that I want to do. I want to be a good person. I want to have a lot of time to hang out with my family and friends. I want to pursue creative things. You know, it's not a be all end all to me that I have to be the boss of everyone.
No.
And I think that that's not always accepted.
No, in fact, it's actively discouraged. I mean, I was always told that's fine as a hobby. That's fine as a hobby.
Get a real job. Get a real career.
Job. You look at the people that are most revered through history are creators. Yeah. And yet now in our society it is, yeah, that's okay, but make sure that you have a real job.
Something
a real
to fall back
job.
On.
Yeah. Oh, plan A. That's not plan A, right? I wasn't even told to go for it, which is coming from a place of fear.
Yeah.
It's like other
I
people
have to
coming
say
from
I was
a place
lucky.
of
My
fear.
parents were very much always, you can be anything. However, when it came to like the time when I was getting jobs, my mom was always like, don't tell them you go to therapy. Don't ask for too much money. You know, don't, like, the whole idea of like you don't want to seem greedy. It's like, and actually I have to say now my mom is at a completely different place in her life, and she would be horrified to know that she gave me that advice. I don't even know if she remembers.
Good for her.
That is not advice she would give me now.
No, because there's a learning curve, and she came from a different generation.
She came from a generation where, you know, here's my mom was a court reporter. So in my mom's generation, it was all about like she still had to wear the high heels and the cute little dress and smile, and you know, she did not get paid equal to men, and you know, she is just completely different. So it's not her fault that she gave me that advice. I
know. I think about that with my mom's own things in her generation all the time.
We need Wonder Woman to come and save us.
We do, but we also need to shift our perception. I really do think this. It shouldn't always be workplace success. Workplace equality and egalitarianism is great, but let's just be honest. We have placed a moral value to money and position. The CEO makes a lot of money. The CEO must be a good person. The person at McDonald's doesn't make a lot of money. The person at McDonald's must be a bad person. Money isn't a value.
No,
it isn't a value. It doesn't make you who you are. It doesn't make you a good human being. What makes you a good human being is who you are and how you act to people. We have just in our culture, and it bums me out, the idea that is a reflection of the value and your worth as a human being.
Gotta win.
If you make a lot of money, you've done something right because you are good. You are intrinsically good. If you are poor and you're struggling, it doesn't matter that bad things happen to you or you didn't get a leg up or maybe your daddy wasn't boss of a company. If you're poor, you must be a bad person. Guess what? I'm here to tell you you're not.
You are not a bad person. That only means you're good people.
You're all good people. You're the best people. Anyways, what's good about stuff right now is look at the access to creating content people have.
It's totally awesome. Also, but I want to go back to what you said. It's beautiful, Rachel. I think
Thank
that's
you.
really beautiful. And it makes me teared up a little.
Oh,
because I feel exactly the same way. And you put it so eloquently.
Thank you.
So I love it. Aw.
I
love having this podcast.
It is fun.
It is the best. Well, I think that's about it for this episode, right?
Yeah, thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Next week, our friend Marshall Davis is telling a personal story. So we're still kind of trying to figure out the format of this podcast. So we're trying different things every time we do an episode.
Thanks for joining us on the journey.
Now more spooky music.
Ooh. In the meantime, I'm Rachel Peacock.
And I'm April Lunston.
And this is Are You Fucking Shitting Me?